Right now, as you watch this video, a clock is ticking. Not a metaphorical clock. A real one. Every single second, the world adds $91,000 of new debt. Every minute, $5.4 million. Every hour, $327 million. And by the time you finish watching this video, the world will have borrowed another $100 million it has absolutely no plan to pay back. The total? $313 trillion. That is not a typo. $313 trillion. With a T. That is more money than every stock market on Earth combined. More than every piece of real estate on the planet. More than every gold bar, every cryptocurrency, every banknote in every wallet in every country, put together. And here's the part that should genuinely scare you. Nobody, not your government, not your central bank, not the IMF, nobody has a real plan to pay this back. But somebody does have a plan for what happens when it all collapses. And that plan involves you. To understand how the world ended up $313 trillion in debt, you need to go back to 1971. August 15th. A Sunday night. Richard Nixon walks into the Oval Office, sits down in front of a camera, and says 9 words that will change the history of money forever. I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend the dollar's convertibility. Most Americans watching that broadcast had no idea what it meant. Some changed the channel. Others went to bed. But in those 9 words, Nixon had just done something no government in history had ever successfully done at a global scale. He cut the last link between money and anything real. Before 1971, every US dollar was backed by gold. You could walk into a bank, hand over $35, and legally demand 1 ounce of gold in return. Money had a physical limit. Governments couldn't just print more of it without having the gold to back it up. After Nixon? That limit was gone. Dollars were now backed by nothing except the promise of the United States government. And when you remove the physical limit on money, you also remove the physical limit on debt. And that is exactly what happened. In 1971, total global debt was roughly $4 trillion. By 1990, $40 trillion. By 2000, $80 trillion. By 2008, $170 trillion. Today, $313 trillion. This is not a straight line. This is a hockey stick. And we are at the very top of the blade, looking straight down. But here's what nobody tells you about debt. Debt is not inherently evil. Debt, used correctly, builds roads, funds hospitals, starts businesses, lifts people out of poverty. The entire modern world was built on borrowed money. The question is never whether you have debt. The question is always, can you pay it back? And that is where this story gets very, very dark. Because the world's $313 trillion debt is split into 3 categories. And each one is a different kind of time bomb. The first is government debt. $91 trillion. This is money that countries have borrowed from banks, from each other, from pension funds, from foreign governments. The US alone owes $34 trillion. Japan owes more than its entire economy produces in 2 years. And every single one of these governments is still borrowing more, not because they want to, but because they have to. Because the interest on their existing debt is so large, they need to borrow new money just to pay the interest on the old money. Read that again. They are borrowing money to pay the interest on money they already borrowed. This is not economics. This is a Ponzi scheme. And the only reason it hasn't collapsed yet is because everyone, every bank, every pension fund, every government, has silently agreed to pretend the music is still playing. The second category is corporate debt. $164 trillion. Companies around the world have spent the last 15 years borrowing money at near zero interest rates to buy back their own stock, pay executive bonuses, acquire competitors, and build empires on foundations of borrowed cash. For a decade, this worked beautifully. Rates were low. Money was cheap. Profits looked incredible. Then rates went up. And suddenly, thousands of companies that looked healthy, that paid dividends, that had rising share prices, that appeared in your retirement fund, are quietly drowning in interest payments they cannot afford. The third category is the one nobody talks about. Household debt. $58 trillion. This is your mortgage, your car loan, your student loan, your credit card balance, your buy now pay later for a sofa you bought 18 months ago. This is the debt of ordinary people, people who were told that borrowing was normal, that leverage was smart, that the only way to build a life was to go into debt to do it. 3 categories. 3 time bombs. 1 fuse. And that fuse is interest rates. Here is the mechanism that ties all 3 together. For 30 years, from roughly 1990 to 2022, interest rates across the world fell. Not accidentally. Not naturally. Deliberately. Central banks, led by the Federal Reserve, pushed rates lower and lower and lower. They did this to stimulate growth, to prevent recessions, to keep the economy moving. And it worked. Sort of. What it actually did was create the largest debt binge in human history. Because when money is cheap to borrow, everybody borrows. Governments borrow. Companies borrow. Households borrow. And for 30 years, because rates kept falling, the cost of servicing all that debt kept falling too. So the debt grew, but the pain of carrying it didn't. It was the perfect illusion. Until 2022, when inflation came roaring back and central banks were forced to raise rates at the fastest pace in 40 years. Suddenly, the cost of carrying $313 trillion of debt started going up. And it is still going up. The IMF estimates that every 1 percentage point rise in global interest rates adds roughly $3 trillion per year in additional interest payments to the world's debt burden. Rates have risen by more than 5 percentage points in the last 3 years. Do the math. The world is now paying roughly $15 trillion more per year in interest than it was in 2021. $15 trillion per year. That is the entire GDP of China, just in extra interest payments. And that money has to come from somewhere. Let me show you exactly where it comes from, because this is the part that most financial media refuses to explain clearly. When governments need to pay more in interest, they have 3 choices. Choice 1, raise taxes. Politically toxic. Economically damaging. Rarely done at the scale needed. Choice 2, cut spending. Also politically toxic. And when governments cut spending, they cut schools, hospitals, infrastructure, welfare. Real people feel real pain. Choice 3, and this is the one they almost always choose, print more money. Borrow more to pay the interest on what you already borrowed. Issue new bonds. Have your central bank buy those bonds. Expand the money supply. Kick the can down the road. This is what every major government on earth has been doing since 2008. And this is why inflation keeps coming back. Not because of supply chains. Not because of energy prices. Not because of corporate greed, though that is real. But fundamentally, because governments are printing money to service debts they cannot pay any other way. And every time they print money, your savings become worth a little less. Your salary buys a little less. Your retirement fund shrinks in real terms. Your rent goes up. Your groceries cost more. The debt crisis is not coming. The debt crisis is already here. You are already living inside it. You just were not told what to call it. Now here is where it gets truly frightening. Because I have told you about $313 trillion of debt. But that is only the debt we can see. The debt that is officially recorded. The debt that shows up on balance sheets. There is another category of debt that does not show up anywhere. Economists call it unfunded liabilities. These are promises governments have made, legally binding promises, to pay out money in the future that they have absolutely no way of funding. Social Security, Medicare, state pensions, government healthcare programs. The promises made to every person who paid into these systems their entire working life. In the United States alone, the unfunded liability for Social Security and Medicare is estimated at between $100 trillion and $200 trillion, depending on which economist you ask and how generous their assumptions are. In the UK, the pension liability is roughly £2 trillion, against a GDP of £2.5 trillion. In Japan, where the population is aging faster than almost anywhere on Earth, the unfunded pension liability is so large that the government has quietly stopped publishing the full number. When you add unfunded liabilities to official debt, some estimates put the true global debt figure not at $313 trillion, but closer to $600 trillion. $600 trillion. In a world where total global GDP, all the goods and services produced by every country on Earth in an entire year, is roughly $105 trillion. That means the world owes nearly 6 times what it earns in a year. And it owes more every single day. So what happens when this debt bomb goes off? There are 4 scenarios. And none of them are good. Scenario 1, inflation. Governments print their way out. They create enough new money to pay the nominal value of their debts, but that money is worth far less than when it was borrowed. Creditors get paid back in devalued currency. Ordinary savers watch their wealth evaporate. This is the most politically convenient option, which is exactly why it is the most likely one. It is also a form of theft, slow, invisible, and completely legal. Scenario 2, default. Governments simply stop paying. This has happened before: Argentina, Greece, Russia, Venezuela. When a government defaults, bond markets freeze, banks become insolvent, currency collapses, unemployment spikes, and ordinary people lose everything. The difference this time is that the countries carrying the most debt are not small economies. They are the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, France. A default by any one of these countries would be an extinction-level event for the global financial system. Scenario 3, austerity. Government/spending to pay down debt. This is what the UK tried after 2008. It destroyed a generation of public services, hollowed out infrastructure, and, because the spending cuts also reduced economic growth, ultimately made the debt problem worse, not better. Austerity sounds responsible. In practice, it is devastation delivered slowly. Scenario 4, restructuring. The world's major creditors quietly agree to write off portions of the debt, to reset the system. This is what happened after World War II with the Bretton Woods Agreement. It requires enormous political will, global coordination, and a willingness to absorb enormous losses. It has happened before, but never at this scale. Most likely, what actually happens is a messy combination of all four. Some inflation, some austerity, some quiet defaults, some backroom restructuring deals. All of it paid for, as always, by ordinary people who had no seat at the table when the debts were created. But here is the question that haunts every serious economist who looks at these numbers. What actually triggers the collapse? Because $313 trillion of debt has existed for years. Markets have known about this for years. And yet, here we are. No collapse. No reset. Just more debt, more borrowing, more kicking the can. Why? The answer is something called confidence. The entire global financial system runs on confidence. Confidence that governments will pay their debts. Confidence that currencies will hold their value. Confidence that the bonds you buy today will be worth something when they mature. Confidence that the bank holding your deposits will still exist tomorrow. And confidence, once lost, does not return slowly. It evaporates. We have seen this before. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis wiped out decades of growth in weeks, not because the underlying economics changed overnight, but because confidence collapsed. In 2008, Lehman Brothers did not fail because it ran out of assets. It failed because other banks stopped trusting it overnight. In 2022, the UK's gilt market, one of the oldest and most stable bond markets in the world, came within hours of complete collapse because a single budget announcement destroyed confidence in British fiscal policy. These are warning shots. And the warning shots are getting louder. Right now, the US Treasury is issuing more new debt than at any point in its history, including during World War II. The annual US deficit, the amount the government borrows every year just to keep operating, is $2 trillion. And rising. Foreign buyers of US debt, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, are quietly reducing their purchases. The Federal Reserve, which stepped in to buy bonds when nobody else would during COVID, is now doing the opposite, selling bonds back into the market. The question is not whether someone will stop showing up to buy US debt. The question is when enough someone stop showing up at the same time. Because on that day, the US government will need to offer much higher interest rates to attract buyers. Higher interest rates means higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs on $34 trillion of debt means an interest bill that consumes the entire federal budget. An interest bill that leaves nothing for defense, healthcare, social security, or anything else. That is not a theoretical future. That is the mathematical endpoint of the current trajectory. And the people who understand this best, the bond traders, the sovereign wealth fund managers, the central bankers, are not talking about it publicly. Because talking about it publicly would accelerate the very crisis they are trying to prevent. So what does this mean for you? Specifically. Practically. Right now. It means that the inflation you have been living through is not over. It is a feature, not a bug. It is how governments quietly erode the real value of their debts, by making the money they owe you worth less over time. It means that interest rates will stay higher for longer than central banks are admitting publicly. Because the alternative, cutting rates dramatically, would require even more money printing, which would trigger even more inflation, which would destroy confidence even faster. It means that your pension, whether it is a state pension or a private one, is invested heavily in the government bonds of countries that cannot pay their debts without printing money. You are not saving for retirement. You are lending to governments that are technically insolvent, and hoping they do not restructure before you collect. It means that the housing market, which feels broken, which feels unaffordable, which feels like it exists to make developers and landlords rich while everyone else rents forever, is partly a symptom of this debt crisis. Because when governments inflate the money supply to manage their debts, real assets like property inflate with it. Your inability to afford a home is not accidental. It is the predictable outcome of a financial system designed to protect assets, and therefore asset owners, while punishing savers. And it means that the next financial crisis, whenever it comes, whatever triggers it, will be larger than 2008. Because the debts are larger. Because the tools governments used to fight 2008, slashing rates, printing money, government bailouts, have already been used. The ammunition is spent. The next time, there is no easy rescue. But I want to leave you with something that rarely appears in conversations about global debt. A name. Michael Burry. In 2005, Michael Burry was a relatively obscure hedge fund manager who read the mortgage documentation that nobody else was reading. He ran the numbers that nobody else was running. And he concluded, with mathematical certainty, that the US housing market was a fraud, that the bonds built on top of it were worthless, and that the entire system would collapse. He was told he was wrong. He was told the market was efficient. He was told that global financial institutions could not be that reckless. He was told to stop worrying. He was right. And the world was not ready. In 2023, Michael Burry made his largest single bet in years. He bet against the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq. $1.6 billion. He did not explain publicly why. He rarely does. But when you look at what he was looking at, a US government borrowing $2 trillion a year, an economy running on consumer debt at interest rates nobody planned for, a stock market trading at valuations only justified if interest rates go back to zero, the logic is not hard to follow. The music is still playing. But somewhere, someone very smart is already walking toward the exit. Here is what I want you to take away from this. The $313 trillion debt bomb is not going to explode tomorrow. It might not explode next year. Financial systems are more resilient than they look, and more fragile than they feel. The collapse, when it comes, will probably feel sudden, but it will have been building for decades. What you can do is understand the system clearly enough to stop being the last one to know. Because that is always who pays the price in a financial crisis. Not the banks. Not the governments. Not the fund managers who saw it coming and positioned accordingly. The people who pay are the ones who trusted the system, kept their savings in cash, kept their pensions in government bonds, kept voting for politicians who kept borrowing and spending because the bill was always going to come due after the next election. The debt is real. The math is real. And the only question is whether you understand it before it arrives at your door, or after. If you want to understand what is actually happening in the global economy, not the version designed to keep you calm, subscribe. Because this is only the beginning of this story. And the next chapter is already being written.